The many forts that still stand today around Africa speak of a colonized past, a people who resisted so much that the Europeans had to work strictly from the oceans in order to gather more slaves. A confusing task, of course, given the fact that so many of them were put onto the boats and then sent to the Americas. Now, again, there is a difference between that of the North Africans and that of the Southern Africans. When I say North, I mean West Africa in general, including Morocco, and the southern parts, I include the Bantu parts in those regions. The Bantu parts were the easiest to transport people as they let people in. But there's something very important about why they would sell, quote unquote, their own people. And this part gets into it.
Slavery, once Europeans started coming into enslaved, and a big part of this whole thing as well, when we say Africans, that is a European idea at the time. At the time, Africans did not see themselves as Africans. That was not the case. There was different ethnicities, and what Europe did very well was they played off these different ethnicities against each other. So it wasn't the case that the Yoruba were selling the Yoruba. The Yoruba might have a war with the Igbo, and then when they captured the Igbo, they'd sell it. So the idea that Africans are selling other Africans, again, is not really true. This is different.
Well, no, hold on. That's what this one group of Africans selling another group of Africans.
We now think of Africans, and they now think of Africans certainly. But at the time, if there was a we are all African identity, slavery probably doesn't happen.
Now, the reason for this is because obviously the ancient people of Africa did not have any concept of race, and it's hard to explain this. So the people of West Africa, who for the most part were on the shore side, a lot of them did not have a real concept of race. For the ones that did, they got it from the Middle Easterners, and even there, they did not see themselves as brothers united by skin, as they would see themselves as united through Islam or any of those things in that context. And so this concept of race, of like Europeans, white people, black people, Asians, Arabs, any of that, does not exist for these Africans. And because it does not exist, the Africans themselves find themselves in a difficult position where it's divide and conquer. It's put these two groups against each other. And it was so easy to break some parts because, of course, if you take something like the Kingdom of Congo and you have various people who are made up of already forced fused tribes. And so if you can offer them freedom from the fused tribe, and then you can make them fight, make those two groups fight under Christianity, whatever, as they did, which I have a video plan for that, then what you are going to get is war. And these wars lead to what? They lead to separation. And so the reason why, and this is why people don't understand the difference between racial slave trading, like the ones done by the Europeans, because the Europeans just saw them as black. And because they were black, they're all for sale. Whereas the people in the coasts of Africa, they saw them as enemies, people who came to attack them anyway. And instead of putting them in your own private prisons or basically making them captives of your own kingdom, you just get rid of the problem and you ship them upwards to another kingdom with no idea what they're going to do with it. And then, of course, people want to say, oh, all the responsibility for that lies on the Africans. Well, one, the Africans didn't know exactly what they were going to do with them. And then two, it wasn't obvious to them that they were all part of one group based on the Europeans. They only started realizing this late, which is why it cannot be abandoned even today, that concept, because if it is easy to conquer, thrown away.
Because again, Europe's not powerful enough. So what happens is slavery starts, it becomes lucrative, it slowly starts to become it is the dominant force on the African continent. And yes, the enslaved are taken from the interior. There are marches. Congo is one of the main places where enslaved go to Brazil. That's firmly in the middle. So the whole continent starts to change, which is why you have the rise of the Ashanti, the Dahomey you mentioned, the groups that say, actually, no, we will do this, we'll do the trading on behalf.
Opportunity breeds people of low class to try and attack. And yes, there were several people who, let's say, of low morals, who engaged in slavery and in fact came out of them understanding that they would get a much better standing being part of the slave trade rather than being a part of it like a lot of the other kings wanted to be. They wanted to be separate from it. But this morality only works if there's no other person willing to take it. And the Europeans are willing to make you rise as a king. They're willing to take anybody. If you notice also in the Kingdom of Congo, they champion people to become kings. Now, luckily, the Kingdom of Congo wasn't dumb enough to just make anybody king. But the Portuguese had their people, they had their eyes set on people and go, that guy, no, now that guy should be king. No, that guy should be king. Luckily, a lot of the kings of the Kingdom of Congo kicked them out, and they were like, no. You guys are trying to be kingmakers. You guys are supposed to be traders and spiritual leaders, and you guys are coming here trying to tell us how to live our lives.
Will work. They have the English flag. Some of these.
So you're saying demand creates supply.
Yes,
okay.
They sold because it was lucrative, right? And so there were people who took advantage, and this completely. And if you look at all of the ethnic groups who become dominant, those are the ones that are enslaving, and they're doing it oftentimes the English flag, literally waving the English flag.
An example of some people who, in the beginning, did not ship large amounts of slaves across the world are the Asante. The Asante were a group of people who, of course, had slavery. Boduk T. Edward points this out to us, and he is one of the people who puts in the early contracts for the English in order to make these contracts about how the movement of slavery is going to happen. It's funny because we have very, 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 very long documents and stories and diaries and all kinds of things from the time that tell us about the transition from pre-European transatlantic slavery and post, when the Asante were suddenly demanded to ship a certain number of people so that they could get guns and stuff like that. And of course, now that they're getting guns and stuff like that, all of a sudden the history of Africa disappears. And no, they didn't develop at all. It was just nothing happened as well. But it's not true. They did develop. Now, the paintings that show the Asante from the period, they show a much more sophisticated civilization than that is said by the people today. It shows a people fully dressed in cotton. It shows a people who are armed, ready to fight, but were ultimately forced to sign contracts. In later years, decades, they became completely colonized.
People. So there's a whole period from let's say 1500 up to colonization, where Africa's being drained of resources, slavery is destroying things, people are moving away from, they're trying to get away from the coast. The whole economy gets shaped, completely differently shaped. So we have no idea what happens, because slavery becomes a dominant thing on the continent, which is why there's no development. Slavery literally stops African development to the point at which then in the 19th.
So he says that's not true. So what is true? It can't be that they didn't develop because there were Europeans in the area, because the Europeans would have brought other things that did not exist in that area. So if they didn't develop from this point on, what would have caused that stopping of development? It doesn't make sense. It's like saying today we went to a tribe, right, in some isolated area, and then when we got there, we talked to the people, traded with the people in that tribe, but yet that tribe did not develop. Like, are you going to assume the reason they didn't develop was because they just didn't like our products or anything like that? The real reason why they wouldn't have developed is because we did something to them.
19th century, places like Nigeria are able to, they can be colonized. And again, just the idea that places with British heritage are the ones who do the best. Nigeria is essentially a failed state. Explain that. Because Nigeria had the British, it's still very British education system, and it's essentially a failed state today. So it's really not the case that having British heritage makes
Well, the word failed state is a little bit harsh, but it is true that they're a developing nation. And as a developing nation, it is very hard to imagine that this area that used to have so much wealth in so much different locations. I mean, let's take a couple things though first before we just talk about it. Nigeria should not be one country based on its history, right? Like the fact that it is one country today, that's also due to its colonialism and stuff like that. When it was broken up, we saw many small rich states, right, from different pieces of Nigeria. Like if you go and look at the Kanem Bornu side, you can see there's a golden rich area. Then you can see on the north, on the other side, the people connected to Niger, those were rich. Then you come down to the bottom and you see the fortified cities there. Those were rich. In the center, they were rich. On the left and the right, they were rich. But then it became one country. And then still within that country today, you find poverty levels which do not reflect its history. So I understand from that point of view, like, okay, why is it that they're at this level of poverty when we don't really see writings about mass poverty when they first come in?
They were-
Most regions of the world, places with a British heritage are better. South Africa was the golden jewel in Africa.
Firstly, before you mention South Africa as the golden jewel, it must be said that the money that was being generated for South Africa was only being shared with a small amount of people. And of course, it was rising. But as you saw with any of the islands, the less people you have to take care of, the more money you can generate, especially if you treat the rest of the population like mules, like they're the uh, animals basically of the kingdom or whatever you want to call it, that generate most of the money, but you don't have to take care of them. They can go live wherever the hell they want to live, and then you guys generate a lot of money. And that is why it was so strong. Even the apartheid government, one of the reasons why they just took care of the white people, even when they thought about taking care of the black people, the reason why they didn't do it is because they realized it was a tall order. They realized it was a task that could not be done so easily. If you've ever seen British Pathé, you can actually see them creating some areas with black people trying to appeal to the international population. Like, oh, look, we do create some black cities. And within a few months of doing that, they would like give up because obviously they'd have to put in billions in order to make those places work. And they're like, nope, and they leave. And this is the same for the world in general. But South Africa was never the jewel in real life. It was a jewel in the sense that, you know, its exploitation was good. It worked for them.
Kenya was the great.
Kenya?
I know.
Kenya's deeply
I'm sorry. I'm
Kenya.
talking about when independence came. I'm not talking about what's happened. You can't blame us now for the bad corruption and bad government of those places.
That's not true.
Well, first of all, there's a reason why the Kenyans wanted independence, and there's a reason why South Africans wanted independence. There's a reason why all the people under the British Empire wanted independence. It's because a lot of them were just as poor as they are today. It's not like the whole country was just this rich place. And in fact, when independence happened, a lot of people from these European parts packed their bags and got out of there, leaving with a lot of the understanding of how the country runs and how it's supposed to run. But that's so deep. We don't even need to get into that. Then, of course, there's the sabotage that came right after that, and making sure that the countries don't operate as well as they want to. And
But if you compare African states that were British to those that were French or elsewhere, but let's get
so, of course, they like to do this thing of like, if you compare this place to another, this will happen, and the French versus the British. So let's first just go by GDP only. So obviously, Algeria, Morocco, Tunisia, those places were under the French, and they're doing pretty much better in a lot of ways than a lot of the parts that were held by the British. And some of these were only freed in the 1960s. So this myth that African countries who were under the British are doing better than the ones that were held by the French. That is not a real thing. And then, of course, there was the thing that the French, when they started the independence part, it was very different than what the British did, as a lot of the concepts that existed within the French, liberty and all these things, were then adopted by the former colonies. Whereas, and even sometimes during the colony, and then later, um, they had an effect on the country. Whereas the British section, they had no interest in any of that stuff. The black population was the black population, and that's about it.
Get back to your point. Look, I've already said, and said that the Mali Empire, the Songhai Empire were great, but don't make it out as if there was the great Wakanda in Africa at this time. I'm sorry, these are few and far between places. The history.
These people are out here watching too many movies. Why are you comparing it to Wakanda? What are you talking about? Also, if you compare technology for technology, those empires would have been like what Wakanda is to the other states that existed at the time. They had all the technologies that other places didn't have, and so much more. They traded with the Europeans, all of this thing that happened at the time. So I don't understand this whole like. Also, I think some people think it's a much better insult than they think it is. It's like, oh, there was no Wakanda. What does that mean? What does that mean? There was no Wakanda. What does that mean?
More developed than Europe. That's what I said.
The reason for their decline was because of internal issues that they had. They were warring with each other. They were incompetently led. That's why you had the collapse of Timbuktu and of the Mali Empire, for example.
So this guy's just going to make up information. So it had nothing to do with the Moroccans coming in to Timbuktu and starting to declare ownership. Yes, there were wars. Yes, there were people who were fighting against each other. But guess what? Whoever wins the war is still West African. But when Moroccans, European, no matter who you want, came through, they started to change things and things started to quote unquote decline. But in real life, I mean, Timbuktu never really fell in the true sense until later. I mean, books were still being preserved even in the 1900s. But also, there's so much to say here that it's actually a very confusing thing. But yes, Timbuktu, the first invasion from the outsiders were the Moroccans. And so to assume that this place was just like two warring tribes that suddenly it collapsed out of magic, it doesn't make any sense.
And why was it? I mean, the fact is Africa was not developed. Why did Africa not have something equivalent to the Enlightenment that we saw and to the Reformation that we saw in the 13th to the 17th century in Italy and Europe, the great cultural awakening?
Why?
Again, what he is doing is he's trying to compare histories that are not really comparable. A lot of the stuff that came from the Enlightenment were just copies of things that had already happened in other parts of the world, even their philosophies and stuff like that. A lot of it is just copies of stuff that happened in other parts of the world. And in Africa, you can find several different types of changes from when we first get writing, right, in places like West Africa and stuff, till the end. That's why I wanted to show some of those books that show the anti-slavery protests, the philosophy, the examining of religion, art styles, including those on the rhino horns that sold to the people of the quote unquote Enlightenment, the many scientific things that were happening in West Africa that were collaborated by the Islamic world.
Of the
why?
Reformation. Why didn't they have an equivalent to the Gupta Empire in India, where you saw a great flourishing of arts and culture and science?
Firstly, they did have a great flourishing of arts and culture and science. So this is an art piece from Africa, and you can see that it has adopted a lot of, in fact, I don't even want to say adopted, but it has all the things that we consider like Enlightenment stuff, like perspective and all these other things. The idea, I mean, you can even see writing there in European writing, the idea that Africa did not create arts and culture at this time is ridiculous. And the fact that it expanded, also adopting a lot of European things that were happening at the time, to the point that the Europeans started being interested in the arts of the day. This is why, by the way, I like to show these rare pieces that a lot of people have no idea about, because a lot of people in their head, they're very in this world where the Europeans are right. Their artists were killing it, and we were just sitting back doing nothing. It's like, no, 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 no. These little concepts that you see, and that's why I like showing the Fayum mummy paintings. I know a lot of people don't like them because the people, they look like they're Middle Eastern and all this other stuff. But that's why I like showing them, so that we can show that that whole concept, that the arts and culture of the Renaissance and all of that is some unique thing that happened to them, is a whole myth. It doesn't make sense. And you can see in Morocco, you can see in Africa in general, all of these people creating these pieces of art. By the way, the lack of understanding of this development of art, which both, by the way, affected Europe and Africa and other parts of the European contacts, like Japan, for example, was one whose art also jumped because they had contact as well with Europe as a people. Having Japanese art range from this to this, and yet people still don't understand in their head that, like, everything that was happening was not isolated to Europe. That's not how it worked. I'm sorry, that's just not how things worked. There's been many speculations, and it's probably true, educated guesses, that there were artists in Africa that did the same type of art that Europeans were doing at the time, which is why it's crazy to say it was isolated to Europe. But obviously, theirs didn't survive like those in Europe. And of course, some of the ones in Europe didn't survive either.
Why was there no equivalent to the Tang dynasty in China,
What?
the great period there? This was a time when there was no European entry into Africa. This was a time when Africa was on its own, able to do whatever it wanted to. It had the opportunity to develop its own culture. 80% of African languages don't have a written alphabet.
So let's debunk a lot of what he's saying. So he says there was no equivalent to the Tang dynasty in Africa, but of course the Swahili coast is similar to the Tang dynasty, both in imperialism and in trade and everything. So much so that the Chinese themselves praised the African kingdoms when they first got there. If you know about Young Le and a lot of these people that actually came to Africa. Also, I showed you a Chinese man who wrote about Africa and wrote about the great cities that he saw in Ethiopia and those places. So to say that there's nothing even close to that is silly. And then he says this is a time when Europeans didn't get there, therefore they didn't have anything cool. Well, first of all, Europeans did get there. Europeans have been in Africa since the Greeks. I mean, Europeans have been in Africa for a very long time. So this idea that they've been completely isolated is silly. For those of you who know, you know, but these are mosaics found in Morocco that show that Europeans have been in Africa for a pretty long time. Now, how much they left behind in terms of what they did, that is a completely different story. So he then says something else that is pretty ridiculous. He says, of course, he says, most African languages do not have a writing system. Most African languages don't need a writing system. You know why? Because it's something called a lingua franca. So in the whole entire Swahili coast, they spoke Swahili, a similar language or a similar it had similarities with Arabic, and so they wrote an Ajami script. In North Africa, there was a couple scripts there. There was Arabic, obviously. Then there was the Amazigh writing, and then there was other writing there. Then, of course, in West Africa, they had Ajami as well. And then in obviously you have ancient Egypt. Then you have the Ethiopian scripts. Not one, by the way. I think there's three. Then you have the ones that come from Yemen that come into Ethiopia as well. Then you have the people in the middle, the center in Chad, they had writing. So this idea that Africans did not have writing because it doesn't make sense. The majority of African languages don't have writing because you don't need them. Just like how most people in South Africa today can speak the three main languages, Zulu, Afrikaans, or English. The big mistake that I'm seeing him make is that he is almost trying to make deep similarities between the development of Europe and the development of Africa, that they have to develop exactly the same. Otherwise, you will not get the same results.
It's very difficult, therefore, to create a civilized society when you don't have those necessary precursors for civilizations. Those are the things, of course, which you don't want to address. And, you know, it's very easy.
This guy literally mentioned Timbuktu himself. He mentioned Mali. He mentioned so many of the places in Africa already. And now he's claiming that they didn't have the foundations for civilization, which is ridiculous. And he says those are the things you don't want to address. That guy looks like he wants to talk, but you're talking for a long time.
To just suggest that Africa was somehow more developed. I'm sorry. The point was, you know,
well, he did say
the history of.
I said it was more than Europe.
Asia, India, China, and the Middle East were much more advanced than Europe in the Dark Ages and elsewhere. Absolutely.
And Africa. I mean, even if we go by his biased perspective of not counting sub-Saharan Africa, that would still include North Africa.
What happened, the great genius of the West, is what happened from the 1600s onwards, when we adopted the scientific method.
The scientific method was created by Ibn al-Haytham, and it was adopted by those people in Europe later. And in fact, a lot of them quote these Islamic scholars that would come later. There's a word, I think it's kashush, which means to be skeptical of an idea in the Islamic world. And that also became a thing in the later years of Europe. They built, the Middle Easterners and the North Africans and the Islamic world in general built Europe.
And when, as I said, the Western mind fundamentally views the world differently. For example, you know, outside of the West, they're much better at facial recognition because they use both hemispheres of the brain.
For a second, I thought this guy couldn't get more racist. Now he's saying that people use their brains differently depending on their race. Outside of the West, they use their brains differently. This is getting silly.
Western mind only uses the right hemisphere for facial recognition. There are very fundamentally different ways in which these things happen.
It's just eugenics. It's
not eugenics because you now find it in places
white
like
people's
China.
mind. Listen to what you say. Not the West. Let's replace West with white because that's what you actually mean. Let's be real. White people's minds function differently. Who lives in
Western, educated, industrialized, rich, and democratic societies? These were born in. These were.
Lurking deep in the minds of these people are these concepts. The whole time he's talking about it like, oh yeah, I know Africa this, Africa that. And then he comes back with this type of nonsense, which you could tell, I mean, this is probably where it's coming from. This is probably, and a lot of them will do this. That's why I wait for them to out themselves. Don't accuse them too early because then they're going to run away from what they want to say. Allow them to say what they want to say, and then you can go, well, there we go then. That's who you really are.
Born in Europe, but they've now been processed in China, in Japan, in other industrialized parts of the world.
The origin of it was white, am I correct?
Oh, well, you're very happy to celebrate the African origins of things. Somehow Europe can't celebrate or acknowledge any of its own achievements and accomplishments.
It's not about celebration. It's about you pretending that people's brains work differently just based on development or whatever. And also, obviously, and this is why he should have kind of waited for him to fully expand on what he means, because now you can see he's kind of pulling it back and going, oh no, they have it also in Asia. They also have it in this place. At first, he said, this is why the West thinks differently than the rest of the world. Now he's throwing it to Asia and everybody else because he realized that he's in a very dangerous point.
You can celebrate the achievements, but don't pretend the Western mind is different. The white mind is different. That's a clearly racist idea.
You clearly haven't done any research.
Okay, I don't. Lots of eugenic evidence that tells you this.
No, hold on.
The moderator really needs to help him out on this because he's just put himself out there in such a dangerous way that there's no way he can come back from this. Anyone who was watching was probably on his side. If they're a normal person, they're probably rolling their eyes so hard right now.
But come on,
It's nothing to do with eugenics.
Yes. It's 100%
Well, look,
different.
there are different
Period.
groups of white people, right? The only reason I'm jumping in is because you're talking about something that I personally can weigh in on. So
There are different groups of white people. No, there's just white people, and then they happen to live in different nations and different areas. Now, if you want to say Italians or whatever is a different group of white people, go ahead. But they're not really a different group of white people. It's just white people. There's no different groups of anybody, just like there's no different groups of black people. The word black people is a made up word, just like the word white people, and there's no different groups. Those things that you talk about in nations and all of that, they're not further separations. Now, if you want to talk about genetic markers that can show where the people developed, that's not different types of white people. There's nothing about that will make them a different type of person in any way, really.
I would say, having come from Eastern Europe, there's a massive difference between the way Eastern Europeans think and the way Western Europeans think, or the way Americans think. In fact, this is actually still part of a greater myth that's going on. If you go to any part of the world, you will find people who think more similar to you than to other people. So, for example, you'll find people who are way more playful, way more serious, way more into studying, some way less into studying. It doesn't even matter which part of the world you go to. Some more ambitious, less ambitious. The idea that different people think different ways, what they're talking about is, well, what he is talking about, trying to save that other guy, is that people have cultural differences in what they know and what they don't know. Just like some people are more open to certain concepts, like let's say the death penalty or something. Some people are more open to that. But some people, once they meet someone who's like them in another part of the world, and this is pretty much how the world has always worked, they will take to the person who's more like them in personality than someone who's completely different, but is from the exact same as
tribe.
I've now discovered, I used to think like Americans and British people basically the same, speak the same language. As you've just come back from America, you know that's not true, right? Like they think about things very differently. So if cultures can be
No examples, just Americans think different than the British. Goodbye. Really? Do they? Do they really though? I thought the Western world thought the same. I thought that was the point of that guy. You just seem to have contradicted him.
different within, you're focused on ethnicity. Okay, let's just take that. White people can have different cultures.
Yeah.
Wouldn't it be therefore very logical to say people in Western Europe will have a different way of thinking about things than people in another continent, whether that's in China or in Africa? Isn't that a fair point? Why do you say that's eugenics? It seems like excessive to me.
You can certainly make the case that there's different cultural outlooks. Of course, there are African beliefs tend to have completely different views about death, etc. But that is a different state that the Western mind is different. Our minds are the same. Our cultures may be different, but our minds are not different.
Listen, you can't say he tried to square him out of that one. He did his best to try, but Kahindi was waiting for him to. He just sat there and looked at him. You could see it. He was just waiting for him, like, okay, I'm ready. And then he said, and he used the perfect word, outlook. Some people have a different outlook on life, but even there, it's changeable. It's something you can change in some cases a matter of minutes. And also, you could see the moderator was trying to put it into a regional thing, like, okay, some Americans think a little different than Europeans. This guy said the Western mind is different than the rest of the world, putting them all in one bucket. Like there's some outlook that is common between everybody in Africa, Asia, America. And worse than that is that he said facial recognition, which that one is he can't square him out of that one.
And actually, I really want to stress
They
this.
are fundamentally.
That
is Western
when you start to
exceptionalism.
put it in the whole thing of eugenics, craniometry, there's a different kind of sight you can measure the head. You can say which is the right
different.
brain.
He didn't say brain.
This
He
is
said
not
mind.
This is not biological.
So why is it? Okay, so
Westerners, for
please
example,
explain why what you're saying. This is your, not me. The Western mind has a different hemisphere.
Okay, let him explain.
Why is that the case?
Let him explain.
I'm upset that he forgot the entire statement, because that entire statement altogether would not be
it's not something he could run away from. But now when he's talking about the hemisphere thing, he just grabbed that word hemisphere, which already you're in like very dangerous areas where you start saying certain people are using some part of the hemisphere of their brain. We all know that all humans all the time use both of their hemispheres of their brain, but let's see.
Spatial awareness, visual reasoning, these are all noticeable differences. So, for example, right corners, we are less good at looking at round corners than Africans because they don't have the right angle.
We are less good at looking at corners because we don't have the right angle. Who doesn't have the right angle? When did Africans not have the right angle? This guy is trying it, bruh. This, by the way, anybody who thinks that, oh, there's like an argument that's going on here, remember that this guy said this. This is where a lot of these things come from. Where did he even read this? I want him to cite this so I can see it myself. Who tricked him into saying this? And I could see the way he was trying to sneak it in was he was trying to sneak it in as a compliment by saying that people, and they do this a lot, by the way, before they throw in racism. He was trying to sneak it in the beginning as a compliment, like, oh, people outside of the West have better facial recognition. It's like, nope. I'm not gonna take it as a compliment that you're saying our minds are completely different.
So if you look in places now that were built, when you grow up in houses which are square, the eye naturally sees right angles when they see a flat surface.
But why is it?
Okay, so how many people in Africa grow up in a square house versus a round house? Like, do you know that most houses in Africa are actually square? And also, why would that affect your brain at all? That doesn't even make any sense. Also, what if you grow up in a castle? What does that do to your four-corner awareness?
I don't see that.
I'm asking
That's
why.
because of how we developed and grow up. This is about cultural anthropology. It's not about biology. This is about the situation and the dynamics. I'm sorry.
We're dressing up eugenics as
very
cultural.
respected historians. And as the West developed, and as you had colonialism, and you exported the Western concepts around the world, you saw the development of these same attributes elsewhere, which is why, of course, you had in Japan and China. There are very few differences now with the originally European mind, which is why it's called the Western mind.
Pay attention to body language. Remember, before, every time he made a point, he would confidently lean back and play with his jacket. Now he is in a what do we call a submissive position, leaning forward and looking down. Before, he was like looking up and looking down at Kehinde, but now he realizes he's being caught.
This is not something that's controversial. This is accepted by behavioral psychologists and cultural psychologists and anthropologists.
Behavioral psychologists and whatever do not accept that there's such a thing as the Western mind. That is completely made up. And I don't know why he's just lying right now. He's just like, I'm just gonna lie from now on. Just say I misspoke. I attempted to say something, but I think I just went too far with what I was saying, and then go back on what you're saying. Don't do this. Dragging all kinds of different, he said cultural anthropology. He dragged everybody into it.
An anthropologist, it's very well known. This is the science.
I have a degree in psychology, so I can tell you it's not generally accepted.
Actually, it is. There's a lot of evidence. But the point is,
he got busted again. He's got a degree in psychology, and he's never heard of that. So, oh my God. Also, by the way, if he's willing to lie this heavy on this topic, then that means this guy is probably a liar in general, and he probably knows better than what he's saying.
It was that moment, and this all goes back to the church's ban on cousin marriage 1,000 years ago. This is where it all develops from. The Catholic Church, it was then called the Western Church, banned marriage between certain degrees of consanguinity.
I hope, by the way, he's not about to say what I want to say, what I was going to say in another video. Now, remember when I said Egypt fell because of colonization, its economy and stuff like that? There was a racist concept, and the racist concept is that the Europeans stopped having children with their cousins, right? And then the Egyptians continued to have to have children with their cousin. That's their explanation for why the Egyptians, quote unquote, IQ is not as high and all of the stupid stuff that they came up with. That's the answer they came up with. The racists come up with is that they got dumber because they slept with their cousins. That's their explanation.
That got rid of the kinship clans, which were prevalent all around the world. To this day, the majority of cultures in the world have large kinship-based families with about.
What's this got to do with you saying that people are stupid? Also, most people around the world actually are not with their cousins. In fact, Egypt, well, most places around the world today are some of the, least people you can accuse of getting married to close cousins. People move around a lot these days. People are not even marrying to the same tribes of people. I mean, today it's harder to track what tribe you are in any part of the world. And I'm talking from an African perspective, where a lot of people are still connected to their tribes, but then within 10 years of their life, they will run into 100 different tribes. But then in the past, you would be stuck in your tribe until you turned a certain age.
40, 50 members, whether you're a first, second, third, fourth cousin, you're treated equally as brothers and sisters. That was done away with in Europe. And so suddenly you had the birth of the nuclear family, and still nuclear families are a small minority of global families. And what you had then was you had family units that had to rely on other people for support. You got the birth of social trust.
Okay, so at this point he's gish galloping. What does this have to do with the hemisphere and the mind being different and any of that stuff?
Social trust did not exist outside of the West at this time to anywhere near the same degree. When you had social trust, of course, you then
notice how he's being very careful with these words now. It didn't exist to any level, or it didn't match the degree that it happened in Europe. These are two very different sentences.
Were able to enter into contracts, and you began to have rival organizations to families developing. You had charter towns that you would sign on.
Contracts existed in many different civilizations, even if you didn't have contracts in the same way, like written down in the same way. They existed in many different places. I've shown you the Congolese version of a contract. Even though they didn't use writing, they still had contracts that the only person who could really break a contract was the king, but everybody else had to stick to their contract, and there was harsh punishments for breaking those contracts. It's true in the Middle East. It's true in North Africa and West Africa, Swahili Coast, China. So this is another myth thrown around.
Both to help develop. You had universities, you had guilds, you had confraternities. These were uniquely European things that began to.
Okay, so this guy thinks he's clever. I think he's saying things that he obviously knows are not true because he wants Kahindi to challenge him on these things rather than challenge him on the thing that happened previously. We all know that universities are obviously not unique to Europe. I mean, university existed all over the world. We all know, especially if you just take it as a academic thing. Guilds, that's so dumb what he just said about guilds. The idea that they existed only in Europe. And then, the third one, I'm not even going to check what he said. I had no idea what the word he said was. But it's clear that he's saying something that is obviously not true, and I think he's trying to bait him to have an argument about that rather than what he said earlier.
Develop in the last 1,000 years, and then when you had these independent organizations, you then began to have cross-pollination of ideas. They would talk and discuss. You'd have the birth of competition, and that's what led to innovation. And social trust and competition are fundamental to innovation. And it's at this point that you see the development of a very different worldview, a very different outlook. And you can see
again body language. You could tell Kahindi. I wish he did this earlier. You could tell he's just looking at him squirm. He's like, yeah, go ahead, keep saying what you're saying. Here, he's got something, and he's just waiting for him to just put himself in the wrong place, and he's just like, okay, keep talking. That's hilarious to watch that.
In all sorts of ways. So, for example, if you look at ways that we identify ourselves for the Western people, and that includes now modern places in Asia. If I say, Konstantin, who are you? You'd say, I'm a very, very handsome stand-up comedian.
You're trying to get on my side.
For those of you who didn't recognize it, not a good judge of body language. Now he's just making it too obvious.
I've got snazzy jackets, and I collect milk bottle tops or whatever, right? But if you were to ask somebody in a tribe in rural Africa, they would say, "Well, I'm X. I'm the son of Y. I'm the brother of so and so. I'm the father and so and so."
And that's what.
Which, by the way, if you ask a European person or an American person, you could still get the exact same answer. If you ask them, "Who are you? Who are your ancestors?" the person's going to give you the same answer. And the tribal way, you can ask the other question as well. You can be like, "Who are you, like physically? Who are you?" Or "Who are you in general? Like, what do you do?" It's still going to give you this idea that it's like a complete different thing between the two is ridiculous. It just depends how you ask the question.
It's family and kinship that defines who you are, as opposed to what happens in the West. Because in the West, you had the birth of individualism, and that was the key difference. The notion of the individual is a Western, primarily Anglospheric concept.
Well, maybe in the West, they didn't recognize that people were individuals, but they definitely recognized it in Africa. And not only did they recognize it, but they put protections around each individual. This idea that individualism was first created in Europe again is nonsense.
Which also Protestant helped to create, and it was that notion of the individual and self-improvement and the reliance on other people. That you had innovation and individualism and competition that led to the uniqueness of the Western mind, which wasn't replicated anywhere else till you had an exporting of colonialism.
If he farted, there would have been way more substance in that than everything he just said. What a ridiculous long way of saying I have no idea what I was talking about. And then he just went and threw a whole bunch of stuff that don't even have to do with mind. What was all that rambling about? What? I forgot what he even said. He was rambling about a whole bunch of stuff. And then he started talking about stuff that their culture did, and I even forgot the gish galloping worked. I forgot what the hell he was saying.
See, the reason I'm getting frustrated, I don't even know. Now I'm just starting to be like, this is actually dangerous. Like, these are a set of dangerous ideas. So if you think about what justified slavery in the first place, first was a religious justification. It was very much the Pope. You're Christian. If you're not Christian, you're a heathen. You can do what you like, right? After that, it becomes the Enlightenment definition, the scientific definition. Actually, we're just not human beings, right? We're just actually I'm more like an ape than I am a human. Therefore, you can do X, Y, Z. Again,
I can't believe he's actually being put in the position where he has to explain how Western racism came about and how it converted from a spiritual thing to a quote unquote scientific thing to today, where people are saying things like the Western mind. Which, by the way, I just remembered something Kahindi just said earlier in the video. When the guy says Western, you mean white. The word Western means white. When they say in the West we do this, they're not always including Black Americans or anybody else in the West who is not a white person.
I would point out this Enlightenment we're so proud of was actually brought in the idea that I'm not a human being. So maybe there's some very bad ideas in the Enlightenment. Anyway, it becomes that.
Great point. But also another thing about it is the Enlightenment borrowed that bad idea. This is how you know something steals an idea. The Enlightenment got that from the Islamic world. So they just picked up all the stuff that the Islamic world said, which one of them was race, another was medicine. You look at the medicine that they practice, it's clearly the same as that in the Islamic world. The canon, they've translated it into English. But they picked up everything that those guys did, including the bad ideas, which is racism, which we all know that racism was fully developed within the Islamic world before it was developed in the West. And then the Westerners took it and were like, okay, well, we're white and they're saying here, this, and that.
Scientific justification. That's what you get. Phrenology, eugenics, which I'm saying why this is a eugenic idea. What happens after the Second World War is eugenics becomes a bad thing. We can't do eugenics no more. What do? We do cultural racism. So you're explaining the world because you're saying that the West essentially has a better culture and that Africa has a backwards culture, and this is why Africa's poor.
So basically, what he's describing is euphemistic language. So these guys are using euphemisms for racism at all points. For example, Western world, sub-Saharan African, Afrocentrism. What is this? I mean, they have. I've already said Western world. They use Caucasian as another one. A lot of these words that they use euphemistically, which have to do with the race, but then they try to like bring it down and they try to make it sound like it's something different. And the ones that are less heavy, I'll give you an example. So the Muslims in America are called Muslims, right? There's no such thing as a black, but they call them the black Muslims. And there's a reason for that because they want to put the race to it. And by the way, a lot of these euphemisms don't just exist in words only. Sometimes they exist in entire passages and contexts where they take ideas like, okay, so North Africa is not part of Africa. It's like, wait, what does that mean as a word? What does that mean? What are you trying to say? And then they say like, oh yeah, the Islamic world, or they say East versus West, or they say things like that. And a lot of people are going to realize in the future how dangerous a lot of these things are, where they separate them in a very clever way.
That is you go from church, science, culture, it's the same line. So when
By the way, what he's saying right now is actually historically very important, going from church science to culture today, basically words today, which they try to sneak things through. But it's important because I've seen some people who are on what I'd say my side, and they start from the scientific age. They don't start before that. They don't realize that there's a lot of racism that was used in the name of religion prior to that. And it has nothing to do with Christianity. Islam did this as well. And you know, this type of this type of racism, because religion and science were mixed in the Islamic world, but this type of scientific racism was easy to adopt because it already had a scientific justification within Islam. The cultural aspect they had to invent because by this time they had been far removed from the Islamic world. And that is why, by the way, you still see the language within the scientific racists. You see the language of the religious people, the Hermetic theory. These words don't come from science; they come from religion.
I'm saying it's eugenics. It's just eugenics dressed up in something else, which you can do with some fancy tests and which are not. And I promise you, these things are not widely accepted in psychology. I have a degree in psychology. I know it's literature. It is deeply controversial.
By the way, I hope that guy has something to say back to him because I would love to see how he is going to try to get out of this. Everything he said, by the way, almost everything he said is kind of controversial. I mean, today it's widely accepted that Africa had great civilizations. It's widely accepted that they were part of a greater world. Everything that he's been saying outside of like a very small group of people, I don't know.
And I would ask your audience to think, it's a comforting idea to think that the poverty that we have, a world that kills a child every 10 seconds because they haven't got access to food and water. Most of those children, probably all of those children, are black and brown. Racial capitalism.
Which is obvious proof because things used to be very different. People in Europe were in a very, especially when diseases would kick up, would be in a much more dangerous position than people from other parts of the world, whether they were undeveloped or not. Some places were so undeveloped that they actually didn't run into these rare diseases that would just come and wipe out entire places. You would need someone to get there.
It's comforting to think it's because we have this great culture, isn't it wonderful, etc., etc. But I'm giving you the actual alternative reality to this. There is a reason why Africa's development stops when slavery starts. Because slavery stops the development, there is a reason why under colonialism, where the whole economy is dictated to and to draw out resources. So when African countries get independence, a book I would recommend everybody read is Africa Must Unite by Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana. Ghana is actually one of the first countries, 1960, to get independence. Says, now I run this country, but there's no hospitals, there's no schools, there's no roads, there's no factories. In fact, the whole of this economy is built on taking all of our resources and processing them in Europe and selling them back to.
The only regret is that I wish he would have said this earlier, because it would have been a much different debate when you start off by saying, okay, let's take everything you said seriously. You said Africa was not developed, blah, 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 blah. So when they took over, why didn't they develop it? You can't just say they didn't develop. We took over. It was not developed prior and it was not developed after. Therefore, that's fine.
That is still the case in somewhere like Ghana, where chocolate companies take the resources, produce it outside, etc., etc. So when you have this independence happens, their countries, they can't. How could a country that has no hospitals, no roads, no factories ever succeed? It can't. So what does it do? It falls into poverty, gets these loans, has more poverty, etc., etc. On top of that, one of the key features of neocolonialism is to install puppet governments, places like Congo, even in Nigeria, even in Nkrumah is ousted, etc. And so when you're looking at African countries can't succeed, of course they couldn't succeed. There's no possible way that they could have succeeded, which is why they're still poor today.
I feel like it's finally getting through to them because they're actually being silent and listening. All it took was one guy to be racist for them to start considering that maybe what they're saying has a little bit of nonsense attached to it.
And again, reparations is not just about slavery, it's about that whole history. So I'm telling you, the reason that you have this inequality today is very clearly, largely down to Europe exploiting, the West exploiting the underdeveloped world, and continuing to do so. And you have a fairy tale and frankly racist idea over there because it's
pause both of you. Pause both of you. Is it possible that there's some truth in what you're both saying? Because
that's how you know it's going through. When they start going, okay, I see what you're saying, but maybe we're not wrong. Maybe we're both right. No, he's wrong and he's right. That's what's really going on over here.
Like, I think it's undeniable that Western slavery and colonialism would have had a negative impact on Africa, but that doesn't mean that the cultures weren't necessarily...
Wait. Everybody pause for 1 minute. What did he just say?
Like, I think it's undeniable that Western slavery and colonialism would have had a negative impact on Africa, but that...
And yet this entire show was that guy trying to deny that very same reality that you're apparently saying yeah to. Now you're saying, okay, well, yeah, I see it. This is how you would know that he won the debate, by the way. This is how you know. The guy just said it. I think it's undeniable that the West had a negative impact on Africa. Undeniable. Yet the entire thing was about denying that reality. I mean, what else do we have to talk about at this point? If he just says, okay, it's undeniable. Okay, well then that's what the question of the reparations is about.
That doesn't mean that the cultures weren't necessarily the same. So could it be that you're both right? I mean, Rafe, surely you wouldn't deny that colonialism and slavery was bad for Africa, would you?
Well, given that he came this entire way to make that claim, I think he will. I think he will 100% deny that it is bad for Africa. There is no way in that he can accept that. He's basically said the entire time that, in fact, he made the claim that it was better for Africa, that Africa was more developed because of Europe. So what he's saying is completely opposite to that. If he goes back on that right now, he's basically giving up the entire debate.
For people alive at the time, it was bad. Absolutely, that's my point.
Oh, for the people alive at the time, it would have been bad. That's interesting. So only the people who were alive at the time it was bad. Everybody else, it's perfect for. By the way, there's stuff that he already said earlier that didn't make it sound like he believed that it was bad for the people living at the time. I mean, he literally talked about how Africa was changed by the Europeans, in his opinion, for the better. And what about the thing that he said earlier about Jamaicans saying they would have preferred to live under the British Empire? He brought that as like an idea of how great the empire was.
Slavery and colonialism were horrendous for people at the time, but now, generation on, I'm sorry, the benefits of colonialism have helped to lift the world out of poverty.
There you go, sticking to the script. Sticking to the script. It helped benefit the people. Apparently, it helped benefit the people, but those places are not benefited. But it helped, but it's not. Africa is still underdeveloped to the point where they don't even have right angles.
Have increased life, have doubled life expectancy. Same thing in Australia. Life expectancy of Aborigines was 40 years for thousands of years.
Does that sound like the man who is saying that colonialism was bad? He clearly thinks that colonialism was good. He thinks it was great, actually.
Years. Now it's almost doubled, right? So those are the advantages. So yes, slavery was horrendous for slaves, but for the descendants of slaves today living in Britain and the Caribbean, slavery, they're not victims of slavery. They've actually benefited from the terrible hardship that their ancestors went through.
But do you know?
Buddy, you've lost even the moderator. He's looking at you like, what the hell are you talking about? And he started on your side. I know his political positions. He started on your side and he's looking at you like, buddy, just give this one up. Also, I saw that little dip that he did, that little cut to the other lane that he did, where he literally was pretending like, okay, we were talking about colonization, then he went back to slavery. Talk about the colonization.
I think being occupied, having a foreign government that sought to use your country exclusively for its own benefit, which it did. And I'm not saying they didn't do certain things. I'm sure they brought schools in and whatever, but nonetheless, they did that so they had a more educated population to do the things that they needed done, right? Don't you think that, 100 years of that would leave a legacy that was detrimental?
Oh my God, it's too perfect. It's too perfect. In the beginning, it was like, everybody's arguing against it. And then now it's like, are you serious? Do you not see how in 100 years, especially since we're only like 60 years removed from those 100 years, do you not see that could be a problem? And now he's starting to use words that Kahindi was using. Legacy. That's the word you need there.